1855, George Padley met a young lady called Sarah Franks over in England. They were both members of the church, and they wanted to be married for time and eternity in the temple. So they decided that they would put off their marriage until they could reach the Salt Lake Valley. And they set out to Salt Lake on a ship called the Horizon on the 22nd of May, 1856. It took them over a month to go from England to the Boston Bay. And when they got to Boston Bay, they transferred their luggage and possessions to a train. Now the train was the transcontinental train that was being built from coast to coast, but they had only gotten it built to Iowa City. And they arrived at Iowa City expecting their handcarts to be ready for them. But to their surprise, there was no handcarts. Well, they set about looking for timbers and wood to make the handcarts out of, and there was no seasoned wood, only green wood. And they had no choice. They couldn't go back. It was past the point of return, and they built their handcarts out of green wood. Now, when they pulled these handcarts out on the desert, in the hot weather and dry weather, that wood dried out. It cracked, it warped, and it caused frequent delays for them, which they could not afford. But they finally left Iowa City, though, on the 28th of July, heading for Salt Lake. They went by the northern route, and it took them a long period of time, and it was around the 28th of October before they got to Fort Laramie. Now there were supposed to have been provisions left for them to go on into Salt Lake there at Fort Laramie, flour and things that would sustain them until they got to there. There was no provisions, so they had to cut rations. They cut the rations to where there was only a few ounces of flour for each man, woman, and child as they trekked forward. And they finally got to the Platte River on the 19th of October. It was snowing. The ground was frozen, and there was chunks of ice floating down that Platte River. Now they had no choice but to cross it. No ferry. George Platte picked up his wife and carried Sarah across that river. Then he went back and he got some children, and he carried the children across. Then he went back and he got some sick people and carried them across. By that time, he was overexerted from the poor diet he was on, and because of the hypothermia that was setting him. And he couldn't pound any sticks into the frozen ground to put up his tent. He just crawled in between the tent and the ground. And between the exertion, the poor diet, and the hypothermia, he contracted pneumonia. And George died between Casper and Martin's Cove. Now, this was, I forget the date now, but it was in late October. And they were supposed to have reached that location by the 4th of July. They have a large rock there just outside of Martin's Cove. It's called Independence Rock. And if you get to that rock by the 4th of July, you're pretty well guaranteed you'll make it safely into Salt Lake and miss the storms and the bad weather. But this was around the 29th of October when they got there. And it was hard on them. And Sarah could not stand to see George ravished by the wolves. The men were too weak to dig a proper grave. The ground was too hard. And Sarah says, take my shawl. Wrap George in my shawl and tie him up in a tree. The wolves won't be able to reach George high in that tree like that. And the next spring, Sarah Franks sent people back to get George's body and give it a proper burial. When they got there, there was no body, only the shawl. That's all that remained up there in the tree. And they brought that shawl back and gave it to Sarah Franks. Well, Sarah was recovering from the long journey, and she was ill, and she met a man named Thomas McKay. He was a kind individual, and he took Sarah in and nursed her back to health. And eventually, Sarah became his third polygamous wife. And they had 9 children by that marriage. And this story was told, and it was told to the first presidency of the church, James E. Faust, back in 2007. President Faust says, that's the most beautiful pioneer love story I've heard. And he says, was there work done in the temple? He says, no. Sarah was sealed with Thomas McKay. He says, well, have her sealed the second time, but have her sealed to George Padley. And that was accomplished. And then when we was on our mission at Martin's Cove, we had a man named President Lorimer. He came up and he talked with us, and he told us that story, and he says, now I'd like to tell you the rest of that story. He said, Sarah's third great-granddaughter came and talked to me, and she says, I'd like to tell you the rest of that story. He says, when Sarah was 84 years old, she had her patriarchal blessing. In her patriarchal blessing, it said, be patient. You have one more ordinance to accomplish in the temple. She says, now we understand what that second ordinance was. And that was the second witness to the truthfulness of this story. The third one was kind of personal. It came to Shirley and I. We was working at Martin's Cove one afternoon, and a large group of trekkers came up. And I explained this story to the trekkers, and one of the ladies came up and she says, Sarah Franks was our aunt. No, Sarah Franks was a relative of ours, and her aunt has that shawl. They live in Idaho, and it's kind of a yellow-green color. So that was the third witness to this story. Now, a lot of people ask me, well, why did they take hand carts across the prairie like that? Why didn't they get a horse and wagon, or a wagon and mules or oxen to pull you across? It is because these were the poorest of the poor that pulled the hand carts. A hand cart in those days cost about $4 or $5. A team of oxen and a wagon would cost over $100. between $100 and $150. So this is why they had no choice. It was the poorest of the poor that came by hand carts. There was 10 hand carts all total. 8 of the 10 had no problems whatever. They went across the prairie with no serious problems. Only 2 of them had problems. And that was the Martin Hand Cart Company and the Willie Hand Cart Company. They had problems because of the late start. So I leave this with you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Does any of you